Hi, my name is Catherine, and welcome to my channel where we talk about books you should read instead of stuff you should buy. This video, like my last, is inspired by The Divide, a brief guide to global inequality and its solutions by Jason Hickel, which surprisingly did very well in the algorithm. It took me 7 months to hit 1,000 subscribers, and then a day later I hit 2,000, and now I'm at 3,000. Very exciting. Anyway, in that video, I talked about the issue with the poverty line and how capitalists manipulate poverty stats to support their narrative that capitalism is the antidote to poverty. Today, I want to explore what the opposite end of the spectrum would look like if we were to actually eradicate poverty. How wealthy can people theoretically be in a just world? Unless you're a proud conservative, you probably agree that billionaires should not exist. But where do we draw the line? Should millionaires even exist? As I detailed previously, the poverty line is set too low to meaningfully measure poverty. To recap, extreme poverty in 2012 PPP dollars was defined at $1.90 per day. At the bare minimum, Jason Hickel argues, extreme poverty should be measured at $7.40 a day. But surely we don't just want to eradicate extreme poverty, we want to eradicate poverty. So that means raising the poverty line further still. In a paper Hickel wrote titled The Imperative of Redistribution in an Age of Ecological Overshoot, he notes that Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family. In order to actually ensure this right for everyone on the planet, Hickel argues that we must go far beyond lifting people above the international poverty line. With the poverty line set this low, poverty alleviation is, quote, solvable with relatively modest amounts of foreign aid, rather than requiring a serious challenge to the status quo of global income distribution. So he sets out to estimate the true poverty line, citing longitudinal studies that demonstrate escaping from poverty requires at least $10 a day, with some calculations at $15 a day. At the conservative $10 a day line, the 2012 poverty headcount was over 4.7 billion people, 67% of the population. It would have cost roughly $10.4 trillion per year to satisfy Article 25, which was 21.5% of the GDP of OECD nations. Thus, genuine poverty alleviation requires significant restructuring of our global economic system. You'll often hear capitalists argue that inequality is not the problem, poverty is the problem. It's not the fault of the rich that others are poor, they claim. If the incomes of the poor are gradually increasing, so what if the incomes of the rich are increasing at a much faster rate? Everyone is technically getting richer, thanks to capitalism. Ignoring the fact that many people are getting poorer, this is a faulty premise because it rests on the assumption that we live on a planet with infinite resources. Hickel cites David Woodward, who calculated that, quote, given the existing distribution of income from GDP growth, it will take 207 years to end poverty at $7.40 a day. Achieving this would require growing the global economy to 175 times its present size, extracting, producing, and consuming 175 times more commodities than we presently do. In Woodward's words, there is simply no way this can be achieved without triggering truly catastrophic climate change, which, apart from anything else, would obliterate any potential gains from poverty reduction. And if we use the $10 per day poverty line, the figures look even more extreme. Hence the imperative of redistribution in an age of ecological overshoot. Many people who identify as leftists, aka anti-capitalists, are in favor of wealth redistribution, yet they support a level of consumption that indicates that they've not actually done the math. They talk about billionaires in a way that lets millionaires off the hook, as if only the ultra-wealthy hold any sort of responsibility.
We have to break this idea that people who are somewhat wealthy are, as you said, more aligned with the super uber wealthy than they are with the poor. Basically, if you work for a wage, even if that wage is $500,000 a year, if you work for a wage, you are part of the working class. And you have more in common with a person working $13 an hour at Starbucks. I don't know if they pay that little. If you work for an hourly wage, you are part of the working class. And if you make $500,000 a year off of interest, then we might be talking about you. Like, you might be part of the problem.
I don't entirely disagree with this take. Like, yes, mathematically, you're closer to a homeless person than a billionaire. But if you are making $500,000 a year, you are in the top 1%. Your lived experience is closer to that of a billionaire than a garment worker in Bangladesh. And to a much smaller extent than that of a billionaire, you are part of the problem in terms of your consumption habits. More on that later. They also talk about the rising costs of certain consumer goods, such as gas, flights, beef, eggs, and clothing, as if these things should be kept artificially cheap so that Americans can keep consuming them at the levels that we are used to.
This is a story about the thousands of struggling ranchers putting food on your table.
Right now, losing 17,520 farms a year, on average.
What happens in 20 years when we're all gone?
The Western left does this for two reasons. One, they don't want to look in the mirror and question their own consumption habits or aspirations. And two, in the interest of electability, which is a valid thing to consider, they can slip into caring more about what is popular than what is right. Western populism, though left-leaning by its nature, still clings to the fantasy of green growth. The message that we can have it all and solve climate change and poverty while continuing to grow the economy is more popular because it allows Western consumers to maintain their current consumption habits. I mean, billionaires will have to sacrifice their yachts and private jets, of course, but the average American can keep taking multiple flights a year, buying 50+ articles of clothing a year, and eating animal products for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Of course, it's unpopular to admit that certain industries are inherently unethical and unsustainable, and therefore must be abolished, and that things like flights and clothing shouldn't be cheap. But personally, I care more about what is right than what is popular. I am not a politician, so it's not my job to carry out the will of the American people. As an advocate for social justice, it's my job to advocate for social justice, and that involves telling it like it is. In the comment section of my video on degrowth, inspired by Jason Hickel's book Less is More, someone accused me of saying the quiet part out loud. I found that very amusing because when the left says the quiet part out loud, we're acknowledging what level of wealth redistribution is required for everyone to live a dignified life with healthcare, food and housing security, public transportation, and climate stability. When the right says the quiet part out loud, they're calling LGBT people degenerate filth and openly advocating for genocide. As I admitted in that video, degrowth sounds scary to a lot of people, so it's perhaps not very strategic to use this term in political campaigning. So yes, I am saying the quiet part out loud. Degrowth is necessary to combat climate change. Therefore, the rich are going to have to reduce their consumption. And by the rich, I don't just mean billionaires. The thing about rich people is that so few of them actually acknowledge that they're rich. This is because our culture skews our perception of wealth. When I talk about the rich, I'm talking about the people we must tax more. So can millionaires exist in a world where everyone has access to healthcare, food, housing, public transportation, and climate stability? Let's do the math. Jason Hickel calculated that it would cost approximately $10.4 trillion to accomplish this goal, based on 2011 PPP dollars. He cites the World Bank Poverty and Inequality Platform, which has a calculator where you can adjust the poverty line to determine how many people fall below it. Unfortunately, their calculator doesn't let me select 2011 PPP. Since PPP is very complicated and I am not a mathematician, and I also don't trust ChatGPT's numbers, I decided to simplify things. Remember that Hickel argued that the $10 a day poverty line was conservative, as some economists suggested it should be $15 a day in 2011 PPP dollars. Since PPP has been adjusted twice since 2011, I think it's fair to say that $15 a day in 2011 PPP dollars is conservative. Nowhere in the world is $15 a day even close to rich. So using the same source as Jason Hickel, with the poverty line set at $15 a day, the poverty gap is 36.58%. Following the equation on screen, which is presumably what Jason Hickel did, I multiplied 0.3658 by 5475, which is $15 a day times 365, and then multiplied that by the global population, which is 8.3 billion, and got 16.6 trillion. So if my math is correct, it would cost about $17 trillion per year to lift everyone above the $15 a day poverty line. Since we cannot afford to grow the economy, that money has to come from the wealthy. According to Forbes, there are roughly 3,500 billionaires. Looking at this chart from the 2026 World Inequality Report, you can see that billionaires fall into the top 0.0001% of the global population. If you multiply the total adult population of this percentile by the average income of this percentile, which is 248.1 million, you get 1.4 trillion. That is nowhere close to 17 trillion. The top 0.1% makes a combined income of $14 trillion per year, which is still not enough. Only when you calculate the annual income of the top 1% do you get enough to redistribute $16.6 trillion. The top 1% makes a combined income of $34 trillion per year, which leaves them with $17.4 trillion. That is an average annual income of $310,714 per adult. But here's the thing, we're already in overshoot, which means we cannot simply stop growing the economy. We need to downsize the economy to return to a level of consumption that does not exceed our ecological capacity. According to the Global Footprint Network, which tracks our ecological overshoot, we are currently consuming at a rate that requires 1.73 Earths, meaning we're consuming 73% more resources than the Earth can regenerate. Therefore, we need to shrink global resource consumption by 42%. Although they're not interchangeable concepts, income closely tracks with material resource use. So for the sake of argument, let's reduce global income by 42%. This means that we need to tax the top 10%, not just the top 1%. Again, referring to this chart from the World Inequality Report, if total income is $168 trillion and we reduce that by 42%, we get $97 trillion. If the top 10% holds 53% of the income share, and we redistribute $16.6 trillion, that leaves the top 10% with an average income of over $63,000 per adult. That's approximately $127,000 for a two-income household. In PPP dollars, this is a comfortable income. Through savings and assets, people in the upper quartile could easily reach millionaire status. So, based on my admittedly oversimplified calculations, millionaires can exist in a post-growth eco-socialist society, but perhaps not multimillionaires. Sorry. There are a couple ways to look at the problem with wealth accumulation into the multi-millions. For one, it's hard to spend millions of dollars without increasing your consumption of resources. As I said, income closely tracks with material resource use. You could have a fairly high income and still live a one-planet lifestyle, consuming no more than your fair share of resources by spending your money on quality pieces that involve a high level of skill and craftsmanship to make, and saving for early retirement. But at a certain income level, it's hard not to overconsume. Another problem is that wealth accumulation corrupts democracy. Here's Jason Hickel explaining why this is the case on the Better Future podcast.
The purpose of taxation is to reduce the demands of the rich on our labor and productive capacities so that we can do the things that we as people, as a democratic society, believe should be done. And of course, the other reason is because rich people completely corrupt our society and our democratic processes. It's in fact not even possible for us to have a functioning democracy when billionaires own our press and can rig elections by using campaign finance, just outright buying politicians openly, right? I mean, it's totally mad. And so you want to tax rich people to reduce their ability to corrupt our society so that we can have what we all believe is important, and that is a democracy. The second thing is, this idea that what's great about the American dream is that we can all be millionaires, This is so interesting to me because it's actually if we were all millionaires, none of us would be millionaires. Because what is the quality of being a millionaire? Is your ability to command labor, right? It's like you talked about the country club and the yachts, et cetera. Someone's got to be building your yacht. Someone's got to be curating your country club.
Mowing the lawn,
bringing you your cocktails, right? If people are millionaires, if everyone's a millionaire, will they be doing that labor? No. Therefore, You will not have the benefits of being a millionaire. The success achieved by some is literally only success because there are other people that are subordinated to work for them, doing everything that they want, right? It can only ever be a few, which is why there's no society where everybody becomes elite. It just doesn't happen. It's always a small fraction of society. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is that a society we're willing to live in, where most people are subordinated to service the whims of elites, because that's the reality of having an elite class.
Right.
We're effectively, when you have an elite class, you're devoting your society's labor and energy and materials to servicing their desires, however perverted that might be. This is an irrational thing to be doing.
You may think that I'm a radical extremist because although the majority of Americans would benefit from this wealth transfer, to quote John Steinbeck, they see themselves not as an exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. But honestly, my position is not that extreme. I'm not suggesting that we distribute wealth perfectly equally or that everyone must be forced to live a monastic lifestyle. I do not share Peter Singer's stance that any luxury purchase is unethical because that money could have been spent to alleviate suffering elsewhere. I just think that in a world with a productive capacity of $100 trillion a year, nobody should live in absolute poverty. Crazy. Also, just because we're taxing the top 10% doesn't mean that everyone in that income bracket would be worse off. My husband and I have a household income that puts us in the top 10%, but we would happily pay more taxes if that money went towards social services that eliminated poverty. And we would benefit from many of those social services ourselves. Like Bernie Sanders has explained ad nauseum, your taxes may go up to fund Medicare for all, but your premiums will go down, making you better off financially. And there's the added benefit of not having your healthcare tied to your job. For most in the top 10%, incomes may go down, but quality of life will go up. I mentioned earlier that certain industries are inherently unsustainable and must be abolished. Think cruises, fast fashion, and meat. But you could still relax on a beach, spend time with family, and see shows, and whatever the fuck else people do on cruises. You could still enjoy fashion with fewer but nicer clothes, which actually increases wardrobe satisfaction. And you could still eat meat that's either plant-based or lab-grown. The point is, we can enjoy the pleasures of life in ways that are far less destructive. There's no evidence to suggest that your standard of living would be lowered without these particular things. In fact, it would improve because we'd have higher quality products, less clutter, climate stability, and far less suffering. Which, if you have empathy, then the suffering of others impacts you, and you will be happier in a world with less of it. As Jason Hickel argues, less is more. Only the ultra-wealthy will have to lower their standard of living in actuality, but such sacrifice is minimal when it comes to life satisfaction. As I discussed in this video, money buys happiness, but past a certain point there are diminishing returns. The only sacrifice being demanded is of those diminishing returns. To anyone thinking socialism doesn't work, degrowth is a pipe dream. Capitalism isn't working, and therefore degrowth is going to happen whether you like it or not. Personally, I'd rather have planned degrowth that is fair and democratic, rather than degrowth caused by a catastrophic implosion of the economy. As for it being a pipe dream, our existing economy is made up. Like, we literally just made this shit up. Money, the stock market, the concept of retirement. Why is it so inconceivable that we could organize society in a more rational way? Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know what you think in the comments, and subscribe if you haven't already. I want that 100K plaque, y'all. Also, quick Patreon plug. If you want to enter a raffle for a custom pet portrait like this one, sign up for my Patreon. Alright, peace out.